At 5:40, the west nursery corridor should have been silent. Instead, a small wooden horse lay in the center of the polished floor, far from the playroom where it was logged the night before. The duty royal guard slowed, checking the movement register clipped to his belt. No child was scheduled to be awake. He looked toward Princess Charlotte's door and felt a stillness that did not feel normal. The nursery wing was always the quietest sector of the eastern residence, insulated by thick stone and long carpets that absorbed the sound of boots. Royal Guard Idris moved at a measured pace, conducting a routine corridor verification shortly after the 4th hour of the morning watch. The lamps along the wall burned low, their glass chimneys faintly warm, and the air carried the mild, powdery scent of starch from freshly pressed linens. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. Yet as Idris approached the suite assigned to Princess Charlotte, a small detail interrupted the rhythm of the patrol. The door stood closed, but the narrow ribbon of light beneath it was absent. The lamps inside were always left dim through the night for the child's comfort. He stopped without thinking, listening. Silence settled heavily, not the soft breathing quiet of sleep, but an empty stillness, like a room that had been left unused. Idris knocked once, gently, announcing his presence in a low, professional tone, and waited. No answer came. He tried the handle. The door opened smoothly, without resistance, revealing a room undisturbed yet unmistakably vacant. The bed coverings were folded back, not thrown aside, and the small slippers usually placed beside the bed were missing. A porcelain music box on the side table stood open, its mechanism unwound, as though someone had closed it carefully rather than letting it finish its tune. Idris stepped inside, the soles of his boots soundless against the carpet, and scanned the room methodically, training guiding each movement. No signs of struggle, no overturned objects, no hurried departure. Everything suggested an orderly escort, yet protocol required that any movement of a young royal be logged, authorized, and confirmed with the protection unit. He checked the corridor log tablet mounted beside the door. The last entry recorded the night nurse's departure 2 hours earlier. No transfer order, no escort authorization. Idris felt a faint tightening in his chest, not panic, but a growing awareness of discrepancy. Regulations were clear. An unaccounted movement of a vulnerable royal required immediate reporting to Central Command, triggering a containment protocol that would seal corridors, restrict staff movement, and dispatch response teams. Efficient in theory, but in practice the process consumed precious minutes while authorization codes and confirmations circulated through layers of command. Idris stood in the doorway, weighing procedure against the quiet certainty that delay could matter. The palace was vast, and a child could be moved far in a short time without attracting notice. He removed his pocket notebook, noting the time, the room condition, and the absence of entries, documenting each observation in precise, neutral language. If he acted first and reported second, every step would need to be accounted for. Closing the notebook, he stepped back into the corridor, listening to the silence again, aware that the next decision would set events in motion that could not easily be reversed. He began with the nearest service passage, moving calmly but with sharpened attention, observing details that routine patrols often passed over. The air felt cooler here, carrying the faint draft that moved through the older ventilation shafts, and the stone floor showed a dull sheen where it had been recently cleaned. Idris paused near a junction where the main corridor met a narrower passage used by attendants. A small scuff mark interrupted the polished surface, faint but recent, as if the rubber wheel of a trolley had turned sharply. He crouched, touching the mark lightly, feeling the slight roughness where the cleaning polish had been disturbed after drying. Someone had passed here within the last hour. Rising, he followed the passage, senses tuned to the subtle language of space, a door latch not fully seated, a wall sconce burning brighter than others because it had been adjusted, the lingering trace of lavender soap that attendants used in the nursery. Each detail formed a quiet trail, not obvious, but coherent. Idris recorded times and positions in his notebook, ensuring that every observation formed part of a documented sequence. The pressure of acting without formal authorization settled on him like added weight on his shoulders. If he was wrong, he would be answering for deviation from protocol. If he was right, hesitation could cost more than discipline ever would. At the end of the passage, he reached a secondary staircase descending toward the conservatory level, rarely used at this hour. The banister felt faintly warm, as though touched not long before. He rested his hand there for a moment, listening. Somewhere below, a distant door closed softly, the sound traveling upward through the stairwell in a muted echo. Idris felt the quiet certainty deepen. The princess had been moved, and recently. He did not call it in yet. Instead, he noted the sound, the warmth of the rail, the time to the minute, preserving a record that could later justify every step he took. Then, adjusting the clasp of his gloves and steadying his breathing, he began descending the staircase, aware that each level carried him farther from the safety of routine procedure and closer to whatever explanation awaited in the silent corridors below. The secondary staircase opened into a service corridor that ran parallel to the main gallery, a passage designed to keep staff movement discreet and largely invisible to residents. The lighting here was lower, and the air carried a faint mineral chill rising from the stone foundation. Royal Guard Idris slowed his pace, allowing his eyes to adjust, listening for the subtle indicators of recent activity, the settling creak of wood, the distant shift of air through an opened door, the echo of footsteps that had not yet fully faded from memory. At the foot of the stairs, he paused beside a wall-mounted security panel and reviewed the local camera indicator. The small green status light was steady now, but the system log displayed a brief interruption less than 40 minutes earlier, lasting just under 90 seconds. Such outages were rare. The palace systems were redundantly powered and monitored. Maintenance windows were scheduled days in advance and always accompanied by written notice to the protection unit. Idris noted the timestamp carefully in his notebook, feeling the quiet pressure of a pattern beginning to form. A missing child, an unrecorded movement, and now a camera blackout along the only passage that connected the nursery wing to the lower conservatory level. He continued forward, examining the stone floor where the corridor met a narrow runner of woven fabric intended to soften the sound of carts. The edge of the runner was slightly curled, as though a wheel had passed over it at an angle, and near the baseboard a faint indentation marked where something heavy had paused momentarily. Idris crouched, studying the marks without touching them, reconstructing the movement in his mind. A trolley or chair guided quickly but not carelessly, a brief halt, then onward toward the inner doors. He rose and proceeded to the records alcove, a recessed station where attendant movements were sometimes logged manually when electronic systems were down. The ledger lay open, but the most recent entry ended 2 hours earlier, written in the careful hand of the night steward. No notation of escort, no authorization seal, no initials from the protection detail. The absence felt deliberate, not accidental. Idris rested his hand on the edge of the desk, considering the implications. A relocation of a young royal required multiple confirmations, written order, escort assignment, and notification to Central Command within 5 minutes of movement. None of those steps had occurred, yet a senior official had spoken as if the matter were routine. Idris closed the ledger gently, aligning it with the edge of the desk, a small act of order that steadied his thoughts. The decision before him narrowed to 2 paths. He could report immediately, triggering an inquiry that would place the administrative office on alert and potentially drive any further evidence behind closed doors, or he could continue quietly, documenting what he found until the sequence of events was clear enough to withstand resistance. The latter carried personal risk. Deviation from reporting timelines was itself a breach, even when done with caution. Yet Idris understood how quickly internal matters could be reframed once formal channels were engaged. Evidence that was incomplete could be dismissed and responsibility redirected. He stepped back into the corridor and proceeded toward the inner doors that led to the conservatory level, his pace steady, his attention fixed on the small details that others overlooked. A faint draft moved beneath the doors ahead, carrying with it the scent of damp soil and citrus leaves from the glasshouse beyond, and beneath that, almost imperceptible, the powdery fragrance used in the nursery. The presence of that familiar scent so far from the child's rooms confirmed what instinct had already suggested. Princess Charlotte had passed this way. Idris paused at the threshold, resting his hand lightly against the cool brass handle, feeling the faint vibration of air currents shifting beyond. Somewhere deeper in the conservatory wing, a chair leg scraped softly against stone, the sound restrained but unmistakable. He noted the time again, the sound, the scent, each detail forming part of a precise chain that could not be easily dismissed later. The pressure of acting without authorization weighed more heavily now, not because of fear for his position, but because each step carried him closer to confronting someone within the palace hierarchy who had chosen to bypass safeguards designed to protect a child. Idris drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and opened the door just enough to slip through, allowing it to close behind him without a sound, aware that whatever explanation awaited in the humid stillness of the conservatory corridors would likely confirm that this was no simple administrative oversight, but the beginning of something far more serious. The conservatory corridors were warmer than the stone passages above, the air heavy with moisture and the faint organic scent of soil, leaves, and standing water. Condensation beaded along the tall glass panes that formed the outer walls, diffusing the early morning light into a pale, muted glow that erased sharp shadows. Royal Guard Idris moved slowly along the narrow walkway, boots silent on the tiled floor, listening to the subtle sounds that carried in enclosed spaces. The faint drip of irrigation lines, the quiet rustle of leaves shifting in circulating air, and, beneath those natural noises, something human, an occasional movement too deliberate to belong to the building itself. He followed the sound toward a side chamber used for wintering delicate plants, a room normally kept locked to regulate humidity and temperature. The door ahead stood closed, but a thin line of light showed beneath it, warmer and steadier than the filtered daylight of the outer gallery. Idris paused a few steps away, noting the details automatically. The latch was engaged but not fully seated, as if closed in haste. A faint scuff marked the lower panel where something had brushed against it, and on the nearby wall, the small brass key hook was empty. Someone had opened this room recently and had not followed the usual procedure of returning the key. Idris rested his hand against the door, feeling the slight vibration of air movement within, then knocked once, firmly but without alarm. A moment passed before a hesitant voice answered from inside, a young attendant asking who was there. Idris identified himself in a calm, even tone, and after a brief pause, the latch lifted. The door opened just enough to reveal a junior staff member, pale and uncertain, who stepped aside without protest. Inside, the air was warmer still, humid enough to fog the edges of vision, and the smell of citrus blossoms hung thick in the confined space. Princess Charlotte sat on a cushioned bench near a row of potted trees, wrapped in a light blanket that did not belong to the room. Her posture was upright but subdued, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the tiled floor. She did not appear injured or distressed in any immediate physical sense, yet the stillness in her expression carried a quiet tension, the kind that came from being moved somewhere unfamiliar without explanation. Idris inclined his head slightly to the child, maintaining the formal composure expected of his role, then turned his attention to the attendant, who stood rigidly beside a small service trolley. The young man explained, with visible nervousness, that he had been instructed late in the night to prepare the room and remain with the princess until further notice. The order, he said, had come through a senior administrative office and carried an authorization seal, though he had not seen the original document himself. Idris listened without interrupting, noting the phrasing, the uncertainty, the absence of details that normally accompanied a legitimate directive. He asked quietly whether any guard escort had accompanied the relocation. The attendant shook his head, explaining that 2 household staff had brought the princess down through the service stairwell and departed immediately afterward. The explanation aligned too closely to the gaps Idris had already observed: the camera outage, the missing log entries, the vague statement from the administrative officer. The sequence formed a coherent pattern, and the realization settled with quiet gravity. This had been planned carefully enough to avoid immediate detection, but not carefully enough to erase every trace. Idris stepped a little closer to the princess, lowering his voice and asking gently whether she was comfortable and unhurt. She nodded once, though her eyes lifted only briefly before returning to the floor, and that small gesture, restrained and obedient, carried more weight than any spoken answer. Idris moved to the windowed wall, appearing to examine the condition of the plants while giving the child and attendant a moment of quiet, using the pause to think. Protocol required that he notify command immediately upon locating the princess, yet the circumstances surrounding her relocation remained unclear, and once a formal report was transmitted, the administrative chain responsible for the transfer would be alerted at the same moment as the protection unit. If there had been intent to conceal the movement, evidence could begin to disappear within minutes. He took out his notebook and recorded the time of discovery, the room number, the names of the attendant and the staff mentioned, and the physical condition of the princess, writing with deliberate precision so that no observation relied later on memory alone. As he wrote, he became aware of another detail. The tray beside the attendant held a covered tray, untouched, the surface of the tea cooled to a thin, reflective film. The tray had been prepared some time earlier, suggesting the princess had been here longer than the staff had implied. Idris asked quietly when she had arrived. The attendant hesitated, then admitted that it had been nearly an hour, not the 30 minutes he had first suggested. The correction was small, but significant. Someone had instructed the staff not only to carry out the relocation, but to minimize the timeline if questioned. Idris felt the pressure of responsibility intensify. This was no longer a simple procedural oversight, but an intentional bypassing of safeguards designed specifically to prevent vulnerable royals from being moved without protection oversight. He closed the notebook and approached the princess again, maintaining a respectful distance, informing her in calm, measured words that she would be returned to her rooms shortly and that he would remain nearby until arrangements were made. The child looked up at him then, and for the first time her expression changed slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing by a small but visible degree, as though the presence of a uniformed guard restored a sense of order that had been missing. Idris turned to the attendant and instructed him to remain where he was and to allow no one to enter or leave the room without direct authorization from the protection unit. The young man nodded quickly, relief and apprehension mingling in his expression. Stepping back into the corridor, Idris closed the door carefully and finally activated his secure transmitter, requesting immediate but discreet contact with his commanding officer. His report was concise, factual, and stripped of speculation, presenting only what he had observed and documented. As he waited for acknowledgement, he stood in the quiet humidity of the conservatory passage, aware that the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. Locating the princess had been only the first step. Now came the more difficult task, confronting the chain of decisions that had placed her here, decisions made by individuals whose authority within the palace was substantial enough to bypass safeguards without hesitation. The reply from command came moments later, instructing him to remain on site and preserve all observations until senior oversight arrived. Idris acknowledged the order, lowering the transmitter, and listened to the quiet hum of the conservatory ventilation. The palace above continued its routines, unaware of how narrowly a silent irregularity in a corridor had come to becoming something far more serious. And Idris understood that before the morning was over, explanations would be demanded that no one in the administrative offices would find easy to give. The first pale light of morning had not yet reached the upper terraces when Royal Guard Idris was instructed to report to the internal briefing chamber adjacent to the operations office. The room was small, windowless, and deliberately plain, designed for clarity of discussion rather than comfort. A single overhead lamp cast a steady, neutral light across the table, illuminating the orderly arrangement of files, log tablets, and a digital recorder already placed at the center. Idris entered, removed his gloves, and stood at attention until directed to sit. Across from him were his commanding officer, the Deputy Director of Palace Security, and two senior officials from Household Administration. Their expressions were composed, not hostile, but the quiet gravity of the room carried its own pressure. Every movement here was measured. Every statement would become part of the record. The Deputy Director began by asking for a chronological account of events, starting from the moment Idris noticed the discrepancy in the nursery wing. Idris spoke in calm, precise language, referring to his notebook for exact times and observations, describing the absence of log entries, the camera interruption, the physical traces in the service corridor, and the discovery of Princess Charlotte in the conservatory. He avoided speculation, limiting himself strictly to what he had seen, heard, and documented. As he spoke, the recorder captured each word in a steady, mechanical whisper. When he finished, one of the administrative officials asked why the discrepancy had not been reported immediately upon discovery of the empty room, as required by protocol. The question was delivered politely, but its significance was unmistakable. Idris answered that he had assessed the likelihood that immediate containment procedures would delay the search, and that the absence of disturbance in the room suggested an orderly relocation rather than an abduction in progress. He explained that he had documented every step and intended to report as soon as the child was located or clear evidence of danger emerged. The explanation was factual, neither defensive nor apologetic, yet the room grew noticeably quieter as the implications settled. Choosing to delay reporting, even briefly, was a deviation from procedure regardless of outcome. The commanding officer remained silent, allowing the discussion to continue, while the deputy director made several notes on a tablet, his stylus moving with deliberate care. After a moment, the door opened, and Princess Anne entered, accompanied by a single aide. Conversation ceased immediately, and everyone in the room rose. She took her seat without ceremony, her expression calm but attentive, and requested a summary of the situation. The deputy director provided a concise briefing, outlining the unrecorded relocation, the discovery in the conservatory, and the absence of proper authorization records. As she listened, Princess Anne's gaze moved briefly to Idris, studying him not with suspicion, but with focused interest, as though weighing the decisions that had been made in the hours before dawn. When the summary concluded, Princess Anne asked a single question: how close the situation had come to becoming a genuine security incident. The deputy director answered carefully, explaining that had the princess moved beyond the conservatory level or been transferred again without oversight, locating her quickly would have become significantly more difficult, particularly once the palace entered its daytime routines. The answer carried no dramatics, only quiet acknowledgement of risk. Princess Anne nodded once, absorbing the information, then turned her attention to the administrative officials, requesting an explanation for the relocation order and the absence of documentation. The officials exchanged brief glances before one of them spoke, stating that the movement had been intended to resolve a late-night disagreement between household staff regarding room assignments and that the matter had been handled informally to avoid disturbing the child. The explanation sounded measured, but its weaknesses were evident: no written order, no escort notification, and the disabling of a corridor camera without maintenance authorization. Princess Anne listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, yet the silence that followed the explanation carried a weight that made further justification unnecessary. She instructed that a full internal review be initiated immediately, including examination of system logs, communication records, and authorization procedures. Turning back to Idris, she asked him to confirm whether the princess had appeared distressed or harmed in any way. Idris answered that she had been physically unharmed but unsettled by the unfamiliar surroundings and the absence of familiar attendants. He described her condition in neutral, professional terms, careful not to speculate on her emotions beyond what he had directly observed. Princess Anne acknowledged the report with a slight inclination of her head, then addressed the room, stating that safeguarding vulnerable members of the household required adherence to both procedure and judgment, and that failures in either could carry consequences. The statement was neither a defense nor a condemnation, but a reminder of the balance expected within the palace structure. The briefing concluded shortly afterward, with instructions issued for the princess to be returned to her rooms under full escort, and for all personnel involved in the relocation to remain available for questioning. As the room began to empty, Idris remained seated for a moment, collecting his gloves and notebook, aware that the immediate crisis had passed, but that the decisions made during the quiet hours of the morning would continue to be examined in detail. When he finally stepped back into the corridor, the first true light of dawn was beginning to filter through the high windows of the eastern wing, pale and steady, illuminating the polished floors and silent walls of the palace. Idris resumed his post without ceremony, the routine of duty continuing as it always did, but with a deeper awareness that the line between obedience and responsibility was not fixed, but something a guard had to recognize, often alone, in the stillness of a corridor where a single irregular detail could carry consequences far beyond what anyone saw at first glance. The internal review began that same morning, moving with the quiet efficiency that characterized palace procedures when discretion was required. Royal Guard Idris was not directly involved in the investigative meetings, yet their presence was felt throughout the eastern residence in subtle ways. Technicians examining camera housings, clerks requesting access to archived logs, and senior officers moving between offices with sealed folders held close to their sides. Idris remained on his assigned rotation, returning to the nursery wing that afternoon as part of a standard perimeter check. The corridor appeared unchanged, the carpets freshly brushed, the lamps trimmed, and the door to Princess Charlotte's suite closed as it always was during rest hours. Routine had reasserted itself with remarkable speed, as if the palace had absorbed the disturbance and restored its outward calm. Yet Idris noticed details others might not have seen. the additional guard posted at the junction near the service passage, the new seal placed over the manual log ledger to prevent further entries until the review concluded, and the faint metallic scent lingering in the air where technicians had opened a camera panel earlier in the day. Inside the suite, the princess was seated near the window with a tutor, the familiar setting restored, though her posture remained quieter than before, her movements more deliberate, as if she were still adjusting to the memory of being moved in the night without explanation. Idris observed only briefly, confirming her presence and condition, then withdrew without disturbing the lesson. That evening he was summoned to provide a supplemental statement, clarifying the sequence of his search and the reasoning behind delaying the initial report. The questions were precise and methodical, not accusatory, yet each required careful thought. He described his assessment of the risks, the indicators suggesting an internal relocation rather than an external threat, and his judgment that immediate containment might have complicated locating the child quickly. The reviewing officer listened without interruption, occasionally noting a time or reference, the quiet scratch of pen on paper the only sound in the room. When the session ended, Idris stepped back into the corridor with the awareness that the outcome of the investigation would not depend solely on results, but on whether his decisions aligned with the expectations placed on a royal guard entrusted with both discipline and discretion. Over the next 2 days, fragments of the investigation's findings became known through official briefings. The relocation order had originated within a small administrative office responsible for household logistics, issued verbally by a senior coordinator who believed the move would simplify overnight staffing arrangements. The decision to bypass written authorization had been justified at the time as a minor procedural shortcut, and the temporary camera interruption had been requested under the pretext of adjusting lighting in the service corridor. None of the actions taken individually had seemed significant to those involved. Together, they had created a chain of vulnerability that left a child unaccounted for during the most critical hours of the night. Idris listened to these summaries without comment, standing at attention during the briefings, aware that the investigation was revealing not a single act of malice, but a series of decisions made too casually within a system that depended on precision. The final review session was held a week later in the same briefing chamber where Idris had first given his account. This time, the atmosphere was quieter, less tense, the urgency replaced by a measured formality. The deputy director summarized the conclusions. The administrative coordinator responsible for the relocation had been reassigned pending further evaluation. New safeguards had been implemented requiring dual authorization for any movement of a minor royal, and the protection unit would now receive automatic alerts if surveillance systems in residential corridors were interrupted for any reason. The findings were presented without emphasis as procedural corrections rather than dramatic revelations, yet Idris understood the significance of such changes. Palace systems evolved slowly, and revisions were made only when necessity was undeniable. After the summary, the commanding officer addressed Idris directly, informing him that while his judgment in locating the princess was effective, the delay in reporting constituted a technical breach of protocol. The consequence would be a formal notation in his service record, not punitive in nature, but permanent, a reminder that deviations from procedure carried responsibility regardless of outcome. Idris acknowledged the decision with a brief nod, accepting it without argument. The notation did not feel unjust to him. Discipline was the structure that allowed instinct to function without descending into chaos. When the session ended, he returned to duty as he always did, the rhythm of patrols, inspections, and silent observation resuming with familiar steadiness. Days passed, and the incident receded into the quiet memory of those who had been directly involved. One evening, as Idris completed a late corridor check, he passed the open door of a sitting room where Princess Charlotte was arranging small wooden figures on a table, an attendant nearby. She looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for a moment, and offered a small, composed nod before returning to her task. The gesture was slight, almost formal, yet it carried an unmistakable sense of reassurance, as though the order of the world had been restored. Idris continued down the corridor, the soft echo of his footsteps fading into the distance, reflecting not on commendation or reprimand, but on the quiet understanding that the duty of a royal guard was not defined solely by obedience to orders, nor by personal instinct alone, but by the difficult, often solitary judgment required to recognize when the protection of a life depended on balancing both, in the stillness of a palace where even the smallest irregularity could carry consequences far beyond what anyone first imagined.